Funding for Firing Line is provided by this station and by other public television stations.
To discuss the case for private property, we have two guests. George Roach is the president of Hillsdale College in Michigan, a venerable small coeducational institute unabashedly devoted to the cultivation of the moral imagination and the presumption in favor of the private sector. Dr. Roach received his BA from Denver's Regis College and his advanced degrees in history from the University of Colorado. He joined the staff of the Foundation for Economic Education, where he wrote 5 books before joining Hillsdale College. Our second guest is the senior libertarian economist in the world, Nobel laureate Friedrich von Hayek. Professor Hayek, born in Vienna, became known in America after the publication of his triumphantly successful book, The Road to Serfdom, which, published toward the end of the Second War, warned against the implications to human freedom of the statist course being set by Great Britain and other countries. But he had already performed the prodigies in technical economics that won the Nobel Prize for him 2 years ago, and he left the London School of Economics to resume his studies at the University of Chicago, where he wrote his classic, The Constitution of Liberty. He returned to the University of Freiburg and continues to write definitive economic studies and essays for the technical journals at Hillsdale College. At a special meeting of the Montpellier Society 2 years ago to celebrate his work, a book issued celebrating that event, published by the New York University Press. It is called Essays on Hayek, in which, as it happens, I have a chapter. Such is the notoriety of Mr. Hayek's opposition to state centralism that they even compose limericks about him on college campuses. Last week at Berkeley, I heard this one. There was a young man from Nyack who slept with a girl on a kayak. To do this while tanning requires central planning in spite of the writings of Hayek. I should like to begin by asking Professor Hayek what would he do if he prevailed in Congress in order to diminish unemployment?
Well, we must be clear about what's the cause of unemployment. There is a current view, which is not completely wrong. That's what makes it so dangerous, that all you have to do is to increase expenditure. And that, of course, leads to the use of inflation to secure full employment. But that's only a short-term relief, which in the long term makes things worse. Because what it amounts to is to stimulate certain misdirections of labor, particularly in this period where everybody wanted growth. It draws more and more people in producing capital goods. And they can be kept employed there only by continuing inflation. In fact, continuing inflation at an accelerating rate. So the dreadful position is that the politicians can always temporarily say, oh, we are going to reduce unemployment by spending more. But in the long run, they make these misdirections of labor only worse. And we buy the short-term remedy at the price of greater unemployment later on. Now, we have had the longest period of inflation behind us which this country has ever experienced. And we must expect that a very large proportion of the labor force has been drawn into occupations where they cannot be permanently employed unless we have continuing and accelerating inflation. The consequence is that we must go through a very bitter period of unemployment in which people are induced to shift their occupation. Now, in a normal market system, that works fairly easily because the relative wages indicate where the chances of occupation are. But we have on top of inflation a system where the whole wage structure is almost entirely politically determined by trade unions. So this normal mechanism of relative wages, which tells people where good employments are, no longer works. So I think as a result of a silly policy in the past, we are bound to go through a much longer period. Now, note, the mistake is not the present government policy that's wrong. It's wrong in the sense that they are tempted to try again to stimulate it by a little more inflation. The mistake is in the past, and we have to pay for mistakes already made in the past.
Well, what sort of shifts do you anticipate would take place if we had a totally mobile market responding
Well, I think very
to
largely shift away from producing capital goods into producing consumers' goods, but in detail that's impossible to predict. You know, the whole point of the market price system is that it tells us of an infinite number of particular facts and demands of which nobody knows. We can find out a stable situation only by letting the market work, using these signals which the prices constitute to draw people into which occupations are really employed, and that would work if we had a tolerably free market.
Well, is it a part of your position that unemployment compensation is enough of a disincentive to neutralize the force of the marketplace?
I can't speak about this country. I really don't know enough about how important it here is. I mean, the country which I know much better, England, of course, is the main factor. I mean, there you have the ridiculous situation where unemployment compensation is paid to the wives of people on strike. So the people, even if they go on strike to push up for higher wages, they don't run any risk. The government has to look after their families. Now, to a milder extent, I think the same thing is probably operating here. But I can't speak very definitely. I mean, the American trade union policy is different.
Let me put the question to you generally. Is it a part of your position that the adjustments required to make up for past mistakes cannot take place alongside unemployment compensation, or is it only when unemployment compensation becomes too lucrative?
The latter. You know, I have no objection against a flat minimum secured to everybody who cannot earn enough in the market. But the same for everybody on condition that he cannot earn more in the market. That need not interfere with the price mechanism, with the free play of market forces. But once, of course, you make it more attractive to employ unemployment compensation than to work, even young people who cannot expect to earn more than little when they begin, of course the temptation to remain unemployment, to earn unemployment compensation is very large. I have no idea, but I suspect that a comparatively large part of the unemployment which is recorded statistically isn't genuinely unemployment. It's just a preference of people to draw unemployment compensation rather than to work.
Is that your experience, Mr. Roach?
We have almost a case study of this in the United States in miniature, because here in this country, Professor Hayek, we have states like Michigan, where Hillsdale is located, that are major industrial states with major union pressures present. And in the case of Michigan, we find that unemployment compensation and workmen's compensation in general are on a rather higher level than they are in most other places. This has the effect of not only causing people to not wish to be employed, as you pointed out, it also has had the effect of driving business out of Michigan over the state line into other places where these very negative forces on business don't prevail. So we have a situation where a major industrial state like Michigan, presumably a leader in industrial growth, is now 48th out of 50th among the 50 states in the rate of industrial growth, as directly the result of pushing the very program that you decry.
Well, how would you account for the almost unanimous opinion of liberal Democrats that in order to reduce unemployment, it is necessary for the government to pursue vast spending projects?
Well,
Since you speak of this as being almost manifestly ill-advised, the question arises why such superstitions should survive.
Well, it's almost entirely the work of one man, in a way a genius, Lord Keynes, who was much more concerned about influencing current policies than about advancing the right sort of theories. And he was operating then in a very peculiar situation. You know, in Great Britain, a successful attempt was made after World War I, which brought a good deal of inflation, to bring prices down to the pre-war level. Prices came down, but wages did not. So you had in the 1920s a position in Great Britain where wages were internationally too high, and Britain had become non-competitive on the world market. The problem in Great Britain was to make Britain competitive again, and it was clear that this required a reduction of real wages. Notice these real wages had been artificially increased by increasing the value of the pound. So because the pound was brought to its former level, people receiving the same wartime wages or inflated could buy much more. Wages had not come down. Now, his first argument was wages must come down. Then the conclusion, that's politically impossible. So we must find another way. Instead of getting money wages down, we must depreciate the pound so that given money wages should correspond to a lower level of real wages. And then by a curious intellectual somersault, I would almost say, he let himself to believe that even bringing down money wages was not any use. It involves a very complex economic argument. And all he said, concluded, was that, well, we must inflate, in short. Now, I noticed several things. Keynes was a genius, but a genius who spent only a fraction of his time on economics, one of the busiest men I ever knew, but he knew very little economics except the particularly Cambridge tradition, and he was much more concerned to influence policy at a particular moment and develop a true theory. In fact, the last time I talked to him, it was after the war, I knew him very well, when I asked him, wasn't he getting alarmed about what his pupils, who had swallowed all this theory, were doing after the war when the danger was clearly inflation. His answer was, oh, don't mind. My theory was frightfully important in the 1930s, because then we needed an expansion to correct the situation. Do trust me, if this theory ever becomes dangerous, I'm going to turn public opinion around like this. 6 months later, he was dead. And as usual, what happened is that the very doctrinaire pupils of this man did apply to a completely different situation a theory which was designed to influence policy in a particular situation. The only thing I blame Keynes for is to make his theory more attractive and effective. He called it then the general theory. In fact, he knew precisely that it was not a general theory, that it was an argument to persuade government in the 1930s to do particular things.
It was an ad hoc aperitif.
It was entirely an ad hoc effect. But the whole, I could talk for hours, because one of the most fascinating men I knew. But the personal magnetism of this man not only persuaded the younger generation of economists, and if I had been a much younger man and a student, I probably would have swept off my feet as much as most of the other people.
Like Nixon.
No.
What did Nixon mean when he said he was a Keynesian, as far as in your understanding, Mr. Roach?
Well, I hope that he meant only that these policies had become so widespread in our time that they had to be dealt with as a part of our considerations. I hope he did not mean that he literally thought that spending more money somehow created more wealth. The thing I would like to address myself to for just a moment is that the reason that the Keynesian policies were so successful and so all-pervasive in Great Britain was essentially because of the ultimate political pressure that the organized labor forces brought to bear. The same thing's been true to a lesser extent here in the United States. Things like minimum wage and the rest that have obvious effects of keeping people out of the labor market are all essentially labor-oriented, and I think that may be changing. The practical politics that once caused the average working man to be aggressively oriented toward organized labor might not be working any longer. For example, if you go into a bar in Hamtramck in our time and hear what the UAW worker at General Motors is saying these days, he's very concerned about inflationary wage increases which appear to give him more money but which only keep him about even in purchasing power. Meanwhile, he's being pushed up into higher and higher tax brackets as a result of this, and on net balance he has considerably less purchasing power than had been the case previously. In other words, the ability of organized labor to hold its troops together on these issues and put on the kind of pressure necessary to push for this may be coming to an end.
You're perfectly right, but I would like to add one thing. You see, another political element was that, of course, the politicians just lapped up the argument when Keynes taught them, if you outspend your income and run a deficit, you're doing good to the people in general. The politicians didn't want to hear anything more than that, to be told that irresponsible spending was a beneficial thing, and that's how the thing became so influential.
Well, let me ask you this. Are you prepared to say that Keynes did not come out with a general theory of income and employment, or are you prepared to say that nothing that he said is generally applicable? Concretely, is it or is it not correct that in a free society you will not have downward mobile wage rates to help to adjust business cycles?
Well, depends very largely on policy and what is being tolerated. I think Keynes claimed to have provided a general theory is just wrong. There's no question to me about this. Despite of his extreme intelligence, he just made one or two fundamental mistakes. Largely due to the fact I mentioned before. You know, he wasn't mainly an economist. Was a great figure who was concerned about public affairs, who had spent half of his university studies on economics and thought he was competent to advise on this thing, and constructed overnight. In fact, he didn't construct one theory. The most characteristic thing of the man, he constructed theory after theory to justify the same policy which he instinctively believed was the appropriate one, but which happened to be wrong.
It was one of these that you challenged, as I remember, in the early 30s.
Well, I did challenge his first theory. I spent a lot of time to criticize his treatise on money, which came out before the general theory, in 2 long journal articles. But when I published the second one, Keynes told me, oh, never mind, I no longer believe that. So when he came out with his general theory, I thought he was not going to waste my time against criticizing. But that book was the one which became so frightfully important. I've regretted for the rest of my life that I did not return to the charge then.
Well, why, George, Mr. Roach, how do you account for the cordite at Harvard University that was touched by this book, when the labor union pressures were by no means as acute as they were in Great Britain? Why did the whole of the Harvard Economics Department, with 1 or 2 valiant exceptions, go up in flames with enthusiasm over this? What is the explanation? Is it psychological or intellectual?
One of the really interesting situations of our time rests in the reaction of the liberal intellectual community to various problems, and this is a perfectly good case in point. It's something that I hope somewhere in the course of our time together, Professor Hayek has a chance to discuss this, because there is an enormous change between 19th century liberalism, classical liberalism, and 20th century collectivist liberalism. And in that change, I think we see just the mythology that you're describing. There are some things that are so deeply believed that we reach the point where you say, don't confuse me with the facts, my mind is made up. So whatever the political pressures or absence in that spectrum, there is a kind of intellectual in our time who is determined to see only one side of the issue until he is absolutely shaken from it. We may be seeing that now, incidentally. The same changes that are occurring in organized labor seem to be occurring in the intellectual community as well, but wisdom takes time.
Well, Mr. Hayek, you wrote a very famous essay on the intellectuals and socialism, in which you attempted, I think quite successfully, to show why socialism is so nubile for the intellectuals. What is that thesis of yours, and do you still defend it?
Oh, certainly, yes. Well, it's a very interesting story intellectually. One of the dominant ideas which governs thinking since the 18th century is the idea that we can make everything to our pleasure, that we can design social institutions in their working. Now, that is basically mistaken. Social institutions have never been designed and do much more than we know. They have grown up by a process of selection of the successful without people frequently know why it was successful. That applies to the market. The market is I was going to say most ingenious, but ingenious without having been designed, instrument which enables us to utilize knowledge which is distributed among hundreds of thousands of people. It's an adaptation to thousands of circumstances which nobody ever can know as a whole, and where the prices formed on the market tell the individual what to do and what not to do in the social interest. Now, in order to understand this, you have to know economics. To the naive person who imagines all the distribution of income is determined by somebody deliberately and actively, it seems that if this is the responsibility of a particular guide, this is evidently done very unjustly. The fact is, it's not being done unjustly because we achieve all that we do achieve by having come to agree to play a sort of game in which the game of the market, as I likely to call it, in which, because we are utilizing more information, more facts than anybody knows, the outcome for a particular individual is necessarily unpredictable. Now, an outcome which is unpredictable and undesigned by anybody cannot be just as little as the outcome of a game of chance can be a just game. But people resent this, and the people who imagine, oh, it should be possible to design all this, to arrange this, accept the government to do this in a manner that the distribution is just. Now, that is literally impossible, because it would require that all this widely dispersed information about particular facts and particular circumstances and particular gifts can be used and controlled by a central authority.
Why couldn't the role of the justice maker come at the end of a process by taking from someone who has more than he needs for the purpose of satisfying somebody who has less than he needs?
Because if he knows that part of his income is going to be taken for him, there's no inducement for him to do that particular thing. If I know that if I do a thing which will fetch a very high price, 2/3 of it are being taken from me, and I can do something much more pleasant for 1/3 of the income without paying any income tax, I'm going to do that and not going to do what's most beneficial to society.
Well, but in point of fact, a great many people who are taxed at the 2/3 rate continue to be very productive.
Well, I doubt whether they are as productive as they could be.
All right, but let's say they are less productive than they could be. But how do you answer the question that the demands of justice are perhaps approached after you have permitted a natural distribution of the proceeds, through the
There
market
are
mechanism.
no possible rules of a just distribution in a system where the distribution is not deliberately the result of people bringing it about. I mean, justice is an attribute of individual action. I can be just or unjust towards my fellow man. But the conception of a social justice, to expect from an impersonal process which nobody can control to bring about a just result, is not only a meaningless conception, it's completely impossible. See, everybody talks about social justice, but if you press people to explain to you what they mean by social justice, what they would accept as just, nobody knows. I'm telling you because I've been trying for the past 20 years, asking people, what really are your principles of social justice?
Well, the fact that people may disagree as to the definition of social justice does not in and of itself argue against the right of a society to attempt to extract a consensus.
Well, they have been trying to do this, but they haven't got anything like a consensus. That's
Well, in all democratic societies, there is an operative consensus because of the codification of the redistribution laws.
There is a consensus of entrusting a particular authority with redistribution.
Yeah.
But then you ask how it's being done. It's being done not by agreeing on any principles, but buying the support of particular little groups. The people who get more are not determined by an agreement of the majority. The people who, by withholding their particular vote, might endanger the governing party. There's nothing like an agreement of a just distribution. The distribution which government effects is the price it pays, or rather the concessions it makes to the extortions of particular little group who say we will not support you if you don't give us an extra benefit.
Well, what if you were to remark a correspondence between the flow of philanthropy and the flow of redistributionist money? Would that just be a coincidence?
It would be a coincidence. There's nothing like it.
Suppose 50% of Mr. Roach's college fund were supplied by individuals and 50% of it was supplied by government. Would you say that there was a natural correspondence between the ideas of justice as screened through the distillery of free minds and as screened through the representative government?
See, our possibility of being charitable is limited by the extent of our knowledge of particular people and particular needs. The benefactors of your college will do so for an institution they know, for a group of people they know, where they have. But see, the great problem is that we have developed what's called a greater open society, which deals with an infinitely much larger number of people than anybody can know. Nobody can form an idea what the steel worker in Indiana compared with a cotton worker in South America, in the southern states, deserves in any sense. We have no instinctive feeling about this. When we believe that we have a sense of social justice, that's an inherited trait which we have developed from the life in the small group in which mankind lived for 1 million years before it developed the open society. Of course, in a little hunting band of 50 people or so, it was essential that you assigned an appropriate share to each member. But this native instinct, which we had to overcome in order to form a large society, is suddenly coming up again when the great majority of people operate in large organizations, do no longer understand the market, and so we are reverting to very primitive instincts, instincts which we have overcome when we emerged from the little group into the open society.
Well, are you saying that a state the size of Bermuda can make intelligent exercises of charitable redistribution?
Whether it would be intelligent, it could be principled and could pursue clear aims. I don't know what the population of Bermuda is. It probably is already too big for the purpose. But a state consisting of 10 or 20,000 people could probably do it. There you still have visible, conceivable needs of known people whom you can ascertain. But the whole advance of society is that we have created an order in something very much bigger than any single mind can conceive, can survey. And we have created some sort of order and created conditions and productivity by applying to their individual action universal rules and then letting them play what I call this game, which is partly a game of skill and partly a game of chance, and that the outcome of this game is are the rewards, the prizes, which tell people what they ought to do, both in their own and in the general interest. Prizes, after all, tell people what they ought to do in order to make the greatest contribution to the social product.
Well, Mr. Rhodes, let me ask you this. Is it your notion that a society ought not to undertake redistribution because it cannot define justice, or because it has no legitimate authority to engage in the act of redistribution?
Both, as a matter of fact, but before I answer, please don't leave the impression in anyone's mind, Bill, that half of our money at Hillsdale comes from the federal government, because as you already are perfectly aware, none of our money comes from the federal government or the state government.
You disdain it.
In any event, as to the question of justice, it occurs to me that such a thing as social justice becomes almost a contradiction in terms, because if you examine the philosophic roots that produced the modern egalitarian ideal, those roots contain all sorts of departures from the idea that it is possible to establish a difference between right and wrong. They deny the operation of a moral framework and ultimately come to the utilitarian goal that all ideas and all values are to be considered essentially on their own merits. And the same people who have said that and are busy then undercutting the more traditional values in Western civilization are the same people who then go on and prate about social justice as though somehow the assignment of numbers, of quantification, will tell us something about justice, and in fact it will not. So I don't think that you can define social justice. You can define social injustice. You can produce a socially unjust situation, but to do so, what you've really done is undercut individual morality and the opportunity to make those choices that have genuine moral content.
But why is it inconsistent for a logical positivist to say, on the one hand, I decline to accept as just that which the majority ordains, but I agree to back that which it does, because this is an attempt, a conscious attempt at the workings of justice by people who are as instructed as any society can hope to be at a given moment.
Well, I don't think that this definition of social justice carries that kind of validity. When people begin to talk about justice or a certain kind of definition of right and wrong, it's always a fair question to ask the source of their ideas. And that same man who is so determined to provide this egalitarian way of the future, that plan for how other people should conduct their affairs, has denied the idea that there can be a source. And for him simply to say that the majority constitutes that source, or that he has a degree of enlightenment denied the rest of us, is arrogance. That's not proof.
Well, let me ask you a concrete example, and perhaps you and Dr. Hayek can address yourself to it. Suppose you have a state in which extreme conditions exist. In one area of the state, $50 a year is spent towards the education of a child. In the other end of the state, $1,000 per year is spent towards the education of the child. Is the concept of justice invocable in the society that says we must do what we can to diminish that antipodes? We must pay more for the education of the child down in the southern region, even if it means diminishing the grant to the child in the upper region. Is this Is this, as thus far described, a rough attempt at, quote, justice?
No, because justice, after all, still is, as we heard earlier, an essentially individual idea. That morality is a difference between right and wrong in concrete, specific decisions and transactions between and among individuals. When this is elevated to a social plane, it ceases to have any particular recognizable content as justice.
But is that terminologically subjective? If an individual decides to give succor to a hungry person, why is that different from 10 individuals giving succor to 10 hungry people?
Or privately and individually?
No, even if they use the instrumentality of the tribe.
Because at that point I become the sucker for them because it's my taxes that accompany theirs. It's fine for you to decide to be charitable. It is not fine for you to be charitable with my resources as opposed to yours. In fact, there's no charity connected with them.
Well, this really depends on the rules of society, doesn't it?
That raises the question, what is a society?
I'm acquainted with your essay that says that no such thing exists.
I mean, is the fact that the people of Oklahoma and the people of New York find it convenient to have a common system of law and of rules, a justification that the people of Oklahoma can demand that the people of New York, out of their pocket, assist the people of Oklahoma. I mean, it's a question which, once you ask it, you would agree there's nothing like a moral agreement which creates such a right. It's merely the fact, well, where there is the power, and once we have a common state, there is the power, it is accepted as legitimate that this power takes out of the pockets of the rich and out of the... now, does it mean that if we have a world government, we can tax the Americans to, our Americans, to 80% of their incomes in order to maintain the Chinese? I mean, that's the same principle applied. That once you have an international government, there would be the international power. You would have to claim that it is perfectly legitimate if that international government decides to tax all Americans to 80% of their income, hand it over to the Chinese, and feed the Chinese. Whatever we may think about desirable future rules of morals, there's no doubt that the existing rules of morals do not justify this. And I would maintain that, in fact, when today the wealthy parts of the United States are heavily taxed in favor of the poorer parts, this is not the result of any moral agreement of the majority of the American people, but solely the effect that whatever party is in power needs the woods of Oklahoma and pays for the woods of Oklahoma at the cost of the people of the wealthier parts, nothing else.
Well, but the motivations of the people who pass those laws are not necessarily the motivations of people who are propelled by demagogic pressure, are they? You're not denying disinterested generosity exercised in the legislature, are you?
It's an entirely different matter. Disinterested generosity determines voluntary action. But to claim that there is a consensus of the American people which authorizes the legislature to bring about a certain redistribution of income is in fact not true. The American people have never asked about the principles that ought to be applied in this. All they are asked, all they are told is that in fact the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, who promises you such and such, will be in power only if it buys the support of the people in Oklahoma. And since you know that you will get from the Democratic Party only what you expect from it, you vote from it, and you take into account the necessity that in order that the Democratic Party gets into power, it has to pay special benefits to the people of Oklahoma. That's what it comes to.
Judged by the results, this idea of disinterested generosity is the one thing we cannot expect from the public sector. Pick your legislature and you'll see a series of special interest groups operating in a variety of ways, contending essentially for power. And I think proving the very point that it's impossible to be generous with other people's resources, even if it were morally possible, which it is not.
Well, it seems to me that Aristotle tackled that problem where there was no question of a democratic base. And he simply talked about doing the right thing. And he was talking about a class of people who exercised
Yes, but he also
power.
said that a democracy in a state of more than 10,000 people is impossible.
That's right.
And his numbers were probably high at that.
No, I know, I'm aware of that. But Aristotle was also talking about the obligations of those in power and assuming that the obligations of those in power gave them authority over people other than themselves, and defined, or attempted to, the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do.
How do the lines go? Power into will, will into appetite and universal will, so doubly seconded with will and power, must make perforce a universal prey and last eat up himself.
You know, a much equally great philosopher, Immanuel Kant, has once said, welfare has no principle, and therefore we cannot involve welfare of different people because there are no known rules by which we can do it.
When we do this, aren't we making the wrong expectation? If I give you a working example, I was raised in the mountains in Colorado in a very rural community and attended an 8 grades in 1 room rural schoolhouse, a public school, publicly financed. But the people supporting the school were the ranch families living there who simply felt that their youngsters, myself included, had to have an education. So there was a teacher brought in and local taxes collected. But this was the clearest kind of extension of the responsibility of the parent to do something for the education of his own children. And eventually, of course, what happened in Colorado, what happened all over the country occurred. Consolidation, it was called there, came along, and the little local school gave way to the busing of children many miles away to larger schools, presumably at the time because of all the benefits that were going to derive to the children. The benefits in the form of chemistry laboratories and swimming pools and the things simply not available in this little country school. The actuality of that was, of course, while the taxes went up 400 or 500% in intervening years, and the local communities were caused to pay a higher and higher price, that the quality of the education the youngsters were receiving in the larger and larger schools actually became more inferior, the reason being that it was moved further away from the basic responsibility of the individual parent. And with variations, something like that could be said about virtually every aspect of our lives, the responsibilities that we have as individuals, which are presumably exercised and discharged collectively, but in fact never are, and I think never can be.
Well, are you saying that the Bronx High School of Science has an inferior record to the local school in New York?
Of course not, no. There are obvious special cases. It's possible to subsidize the Vienna Opera House, too, but that is not well, I think the exception almost proves the rule.
Well, may I comment on this? You know, I'm by birth an Austrian, and I love the Vienna Opera, but whether it's really justifiable to tax 7 million people in order to give 500,000 the chance to have a first-class opera, I'm very doubtful indeed.
Our examiner today is Mr. Jeff Greenfield. Familiar to viewers of this program, Mr. Greenfield is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, where he was the editor of the student paper. He's a graduate of the law school at Yale University. He was a speechwriter for Senator Robert Kennedy and for Mayor John Lindsay before belatedly retiring to become a freelance writer.
Also an alumnus of the Bronx High School of Science, I might add.
I know.
My first question is, why are you all wearing the same tie? Is this some cabal, some collectivist plot?
I won't talk.
Okay. Then on to more trivial concerns. Mr. Roach, let's start with this concept of social justice. If a state within a federal republic such as ours were to deny, as they did, citizens the right to vote because of the color of their skins, I would assume you would regard that as an example of injustice.
Yes, fine.
Permitting federal intervention, even though it perhaps overwhelmed local traditions. Now, it seems to me that there is an easy case where one can define an example of social injustice. And to define social injustice requires a norm from which there is a departure. Hence, one aspect of social justice we could all agree on is skin color is not a legitimate basis on which not to vote. So my question to you, and I suppose also to Professor Hayek, is your skepticism about social justice confined to the sphere of economics, or are you skeptical about any ability to define it?
Well, I'm highly skeptical when government extends its authority into areas where it simply is not properly qualified to judge, and where there is no basic definition of how it should be performing. Your example, of course, refers to the political process. Obviously, for the state to determine the conditions under which people should vote is an area where the state must make the rules.
Now I want to elaborate on that and ask Dr. Hayek one, because I'm now going to get into the economic sphere.
I'm afraid I have a lot to say on this subject, if you could start me on it.
Okay.
I mean, the point we must start from is that the classical demand is that the state ought to treat all people equally, in spite of the fact that they are very unequal. You can't deduce from this the rule that because people are unequal, he ought to treat them unequally in order to make them equal. And that's what social justice amounts to. It's a demand that the state should treat the different people differently in order to place them in the same position. The rule of equal treatment applies only to things the state has to do in any case. But to making people equal a goal of governmental policy would force government to treat people very unequally indeed.
Let me, though, pursue an area where we get into the field of economics. In the field of politics, once again, people with access to a great deal of money are frequently said to have a tremendous advantage over people without money when competing for public office, given the demands. Now, if the state taxes us, or indeed as they have done in current federal income tax, gives us the opportunity to check off on our income tax forms that we wish some of our money, $5 or $2, diverted to public financing, which is then distributed to candidates who meet equivalent standards for qualifying, so that they can be brought up to a level of equality. Does this offend your sense of...
How are they being brought up to a level of equality?
They are being, let me limit that. They are being brought up to a level of equality in the resources they may commit to the goal of getting elected. It diminishes the inequality between rich and poor people to buy advertising time, print speeches, attend rallies, the panoply of politics. Does this offend your sense of what the government ought to be doing?
Yes. You see, what you're discussing is a case where government ought to make people observe the same rules. And I'm all in favor of that. But if the different people observe the same rules, the result for them will be very different. What you are suggesting, the whole theory of social justice is suggesting, the government ought to treat the people very differently in order to put them in the same material position. That has nothing to do with the original claim for equality of the rules which government forces all people to apply. That this ideal has only been imperfectly achieved, I admit. And let's push on in the direction that government must force all people to obey the same rules.
But it seems to me that in the absence of redistribution in at least this area, you are left with Anatole France's observation about the rich and poor equally being forbidden to sleep under bridges and beg in the park.
Yes, but is that wrong?
Oh, I think it is, the fact that it is right in some perverse sense indicates how wrong it is. I think in the field of politics, if access to political power depends on who has the greater amount of wealth, there is something indeed wrong with that.
Yes, but I mean the government prohibits a great many people, a great many things which only young and strong people can do, and which I can no longer do. I mean, if the government prevents me from climbing some difficult peak, which 50 years ago I would love to do, it doesn't affect me because I no longer try. It's equally a discriminating rule, but it's a general rule.
Equally? Well,
if we're looking for social justice, let's not keep looking in political places. Let's look in social places and see some examples of governmental policy directly applied there, in which case we get a very different kind of a set of answers.
I'd like to ask Mr. Buckley, in fact, just that kind of question. At least I think it's that kind of question. I'm sure he'll let me know if it's not. The abortion controversy. If we assume that the Supreme Court decision will stand, that is to say that the state may not limit abortions in the first 3 months, then does it offend your sense of justice, social or individual or otherwise, that we are now going to say that public money will not be available for this particular medical procedure, which has been legitimated at least by the Supreme Court, such that a wealthy person or a middle-class person might terminate a pregnancy and a poor person may not?
No, not in the least, because it is in no way to be distinguished from other rights protected by the Supreme Court, which are enjoyed uniquely by those who have the resources to enjoy them. The Supreme Court 15 years ago denied to the State Department the right to withhold a passport. Mm-hmm. This was a meaningless gesture as far as millions of Americans were concerned, who simply didn't have the resources to use a passport to go to the Vienna Opera House. But nevertheless, the finding of the Supreme Court may or may not have been defensible. The notion that the discovery of a right by the Supreme Court is tantamount to the bequeathing of the means is, I think, a mistake that's often made by you types.
After what you just said, I would think there would be a little more humility about mistakes. You are saying that in any logical sense, the right to travel or to publish a newspaper or to eat caviar and drink wine or whatever resource is functionally equivalent to the right not to be compelled to carry a fetus to term against a woman's will? Is this the precept? Is this what you have just said?
Well, it is everything is subject to caricature.
Who was the artist in this case?
Mr. Bertrand de Jouvenel, in his book The Ethics of Redistribution, said that it is the height of arrogance, and I agree with him, for anybody to presume to know what deprivations mean to individual people. For an individual who loses his Mona Lisa, let us say, we are simply not in a position to say that he is less anguished than the person who has to sleep under a bridge at night. And I think it's very important for you to meditate that. In fact, if you want to take a few minutes off, you may.
No, I must say, I think that statement ought to go absolutely unchallenged. Let it just sit there for a moment for what it is. But let me ask Dr. Hayek another question, which I think gets back to something Mr. Buckley was asking you in his more lucid discussion. The Road to Serfdom, the book that most of us know you for, I think, was particularly eloquent about the dangers or the folly of massive and particular intervention in an administrative sense. At least that's what I recall. What Mr. Buckley, I think, was asking you, what I'd like to pursue is, would a simple redistributive policy on the part of government offend you or make you as concerned as the warnings you raised about a state that was intervening specifically all throughout our lives? In other words, a simple statement, make your money how you see fit. We will take X% of it to heal the wounds of the poor. Is this as dangerous a policy?
The answer is very definitely yes, because any redistributive policy requires a discriminating treatment of different people. You cannot, so long as you treat all the people according to the same formal rules, forcing them to act only to observe the same rule, bring about any distribution of incomes. Once you decide that government is entitled to take from some people in order to give it to others, this is automatically discrimination of a kind for which there can be no general rule. They are purely arbitrary.
Why isn't the general rule all those in Class A, $20,000 to $30,000 a year, pay X, all those in Class B pay Y, all those in Class C receive X? Why is it not a general rule as opposed to the
Well, it
road to
depends
serfdom?
on
Because X doesn't equal Y.
The very difficult question how to define a general rule. I mean, after long discussion in jurisprudence, it has come out that the essential point about a general rule is that you cannot predict who will profit from it and who will suffer from it. Any rule where you know beforehand who will be the gainers and who will be the sufferers is in that sense not a general rule.
But now, does this fact that it is not a general rule make it nonetheless inadvisable?
Inadvisable because once you authorize government to act arbitrarily, there's no limit to it.
Now, I think I want to make sure I understand this. The word arbitrary all of a sudden came in there. Why
Not a
is it
sudden.
arbitrary
Not
if one
acting
understands
according
what?
to a rule is arbitrary.
I'm sorry?
Not acting according to a general rule is arbitrary. It's the only way in which you can define arbitrary.
I don't see why, if one understands exactly the premises on which one is making distinctions. Why is it arbitrary? I distinguish between rich and poor when I tax them because rich people have more discretionary income.
Well, it's, you distinguish between the people whom you want to have more and the people whom you want to have less.
But why is it arbitrary? I've given you what I think at least is a plausible and defensible reason for distinguishing
Well,
among
the
them.
distinction is between, I can only say, a general rule which applies equally to all and a rule which distinguishes between different groups.
Arbitrary does not necessarily mean thoughtless.
Yes, I understand.
That's correct.
I understand that part, but it seems to me that one is moving from a descriptive to a normative judgment in an effort to set forth a rule which will make it impossible for government to treat different people differently. Yeah.
Let me come up with perhaps a suitable example. If you went back to an earlier time in American history, the goal, always imperfectly realized, was that the blindfolded goddess of justice stood before us all dispensing her favors equally and to all who came before her. If you take various governmental programs arbitrarily conceived, as Professor Hayek is using the word, take affirmative action in our time. Now we have a law which says come before the blindfolded goddess of justice, but now she's encouraged to peek, and she says, first tell me your color, tell me your sex, and then I will tell you how we are going to treat you. Well, now, you know, there are Lithuanian minorities as well as black or whatever. The only majority in this country that I know of course, are women. There are more women than men. But every other grouping, ethnic or otherwise, into which we can break ourselves turns out to be a series of minority relationships.
But
and it is highly arbitrary to select some of those to say, these are the people whom we single out for special
Just very
treatment,
quickly,
and these are the people whom we penalize.
There's only been one minority in American history that I know of that was legally enslaved.
Yes, and it was a legal process which made that possible.
Yeah.
The enslavement came as the direct result of the state determining the affairs of men.
It was arbitrary.
Yes.
But
Would you accept that on your
I'm
principle?
terribly sorry, Dr. Hayek, but we have to say good night. Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Roach, and thank you very much,
You
Ms.
only just
Greenfield, and
started.
thank you, ladies from the Sacred Heart at Yonkers.
For a printed, bound transcript of this program, send $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina, 29250. Indicate the subject of the program and please allow 3 weeks for delivery. This program was produced by SICA, which is solely responsible for its content. Funding was provided by this station and by other public television stations.